Hello and welcome to the Run Testers. My name's Nick, and in this video we're going to be comparing the Suunto Race, the Garmin Forerunner 965 and the Polar Vantage V3. So the Suunto Race, Vantage V3 and Garmin Forerunner 965 are all AMOLED sports watches that fall into a similar price category and have similar features in many ways, so we thought it was worth comparing as they're likely to be watches that you're picking between if you are on the lookout for an AMOLED watch with maps and multiband GPS in particular. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the design of the three watches, but we're not going to go into great detail here. We do have full reviews of all three on the channel where you can get more details on the design, so in this section I'm just going to quickly pick out some of the differences between them rather than diving into every single sensor they have. So they're all AMOLED sports watches. As I mentioned, they've got similar screen sizes, around 1.4 inches, and they're similar in size as well. The Suunto Race is the slightly larger watch, but also slightly thinner. But the watch cases are pretty similar across the board. The Suunto has a bit more metal on it in general, I'd say, and you can get a steel or titanium version of the watch. The Polar Vantage V3 has an aluminium bezel and case, whereas the Garmin Forerunner 965 has a plastic case with a thin titanium bezel on it. The Polar and the Garmin watches both use Gorilla Glass for their screens, whereas the Suunto Race does have a sapphire crystal screen, which is that little bit more durable. You also get a little bit more water resistance with the Suunto, which is waterproof to depths of 100 meters, whereas it's 50 meters on the Polar and the Garmin. All the watches have touch screens. The Polar and the Garmin have 5-button setups, whereas the Suunto goes for 3 buttons, with one of them being a digital dial. All the watches have the sensors and tech you'd expect in a top sports watch, things like an altimeter, multiband GPS, optical heart rate sensor. They'll do things like track your blood oxygen saturation as well. And then with the Garmin watch, you can connect to external sensors using both Bluetooth and ANT+, whereas it's just Bluetooth with the Suunto and the Polar. I'm going to dive into the battery life with our real world testing a bit later in the review, but for now here are the listed stats for each watch, and we've listed them for watch mode, multiband GPS, and then the longest activity mode available, the most impressive power saving option. Like, as you can see on the listed stats, the Polar really shines on these. It's got some very impressive listed stats. Not sure we really found that was borne out by real world use, but one thing that does stand out is how long the Suunto Race will last in multiband mode. And then when it comes to your general use, if you're turning the screen always on, you are going to get a significantly better life out of the Garmin and the Suunto. But all of them are pretty okay considering that they are AMOLED watches. One area we're not going to cover off in the run test, but I did want to talk about now, is smart features, because this is an area where the Garmin Forerunner 965 does have a clear advantage. It offers extra features like music storage and contactless NFC payments, which you won't get on the Polar and Suunto watches. Garmin also has the Connect IQ App Store, which is not a brilliant app store by any means compared to something like the Apple App Store or Google Play, but it does have a few extras you can add to the watch. Not really stuff you're getting on the Suunto and Polar watches yet. They are much more focused on being sports watches. You're just getting basic smart features like notifications, a weather forecast app, and music controls for your phone. So if you're looking at smart features as a crossover watch, the Garmin Forerunner 965 certainly has the edge. That's something we'd all agree on. When it comes to the look and feel of the watches and how they feel on the wrist wearing them 24/7, the Garmin and the Polar are notably lighter and a little bit nicer to wear. I think they feel a bit thinner on the wrist as well, even though the Suunto is listed as the thinnest watch of the three. But obviously the big advantage with the Suunto when it comes to design is the durability you're getting there with the steel or titanium bezel and that sapphire crystal screen in particular. You know, for the most part, Gorilla Glass is certainly fine for general use when you're running, but I have scratched the screen on the Forerunner 965 very slightly during a long trail run. So if that's something you're worried about, you are going to get the hardier design with the Suunto Race. And some people might prefer the chunkier metal look it has as well if you don't have particularly thin wrists. In terms of interacting with the software and the user interface in general, I do think Garmin's is the most slick and easy to use. A lot of that will be down to what you're used to, of course, but I do think it's really well laid out, and Garmin is making the best use of its AMOLED screen and showing off loads of stuff with bright colours. Suunto and Polar will probably improve on that front in the future. Suunto can be a little bit laggy on the raise to wake and stuff like that, but hasn't really been a major problem for me. I think it's been a bit worse for Mike actually this, and I've not really had significant problems with it. So overall, I think the user experience is better on Garmin, but you'll have a pretty good time with the Polar and the Suunto once you get used to them. I just don't think they're quite as slick as the Garmin's.
On design, the Vantage V3 for me is probably the most subtle and non-sporty looks-wise. It's got slightly cleaner lines than the other two. The Suunto's bigger titanium bezel makes it the bulkiest of the three, and it's notably heavier on the wrist. I think less comfortable as well than the other two watches because of that. The Polar's a little fatter than the Garmin 965, and the 965 is probably the most compact and nice to wear overall. On 24/7 comfort, the Polar and Garmin are sort of neck and neck, but the strap wins it for me on the Garmin. When it comes to the AMOLED screens, I don't think there's that much to choose in terms of the brightness and legibility when I'm out running. They're all good. If anything, the Polar and Garmin are a bit punchier than the Suunto, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference when I'm running, I found. On the controls, I quite like Polar's bigger textured buttons that you get. I think the Garmin and Polar touchscreens are marginally snappier and more responsive than Suunto's. I'm not the biggest fan of the Suunto crown either. I find it's a bit big and it's a bit protruding. It catches a bit on my hairs and on my skin. I also find Suunto's navigation sometimes confusing. It always has been for me, and it's definitely laggier than the 965 and the V3 when you start flicking through those screens quickly. Now, a quick word on durability as well. My Garmin screen scratched quite easily just during a run. The others haven't, at least not yet. That's not to say they won't, and I've been using the Garmin Forerunner 965 for much longer, so it's maybe not a fair comparison, but it has scratched. The other thing to say is the strap on the Garmin is a little bit more comfortable out of the three. I'm not really a fan of the Suunto pin clasp. I find it really quite hard to get a precise fit. You can change the straps on all three though if you want to. It's another small thing as well, but I much prefer Garmin's charger. It locks in place more reliably than the Polar and the Suunto magnet chargers, which I found sometimes can fall off if you're not careful how you place them. GPS then, well, in most of my tests in max accuracy mode, I found the dual band accuracy to be pretty reliable across all three watches. I've had pretty good correlation, not just on the total distances, but also when you dig into the GPS track details. Though there have been a few occasions where the Suunto Race struggled most, adding small switchbacks that I didn't do and taking traces kind of wide of the paths that I've run whilst the others lock on quite nicely. It also really struggled sometimes when I went through underpasses here in London. The Garmin and Polar were pretty reliable, bit of a match there, but all of them sometimes stray. One other consideration though that I found in my tests, the Polar struggled in the lowest frequency power saving mode on a couple of runs. It was so far out that the distance tracking became pretty meaningless. So that's one thing to consider if you're thinking about those longest runtime power settings to do something like run an ultra.
So in terms of GPS performance, I would say I've had a very good experience with all three of these watches during my testing period. And I think if I was looking or reaching for a watch for a race or a run where I knew potentially I could have some issues in terms of GPS performance, I'd have no issues going for any three of these watches. Now, I have been using them in those kind of top dual band GPS modes, and that mode is designed to, in exchange of a little bit more battery life, give you better performance in terms of positioning accuracy in scenarios where you are running near tall buildings and kind of deeply kind of forested, wooded areas, when you're in adverse weather conditions as well too. Now, I've done plenty of runs with these watches together, and just to see how that, dual band mode kind of pans out. Now, I've used the Garmin a lot more, I've had it longer, and I've generally found that very good for me. And on most of the runs, I would say the Suunto Race and the Garmin Forerunner 965 has felt a little bit more in line in terms of that accuracy, in terms of that performance. But I would say that the Garmin hasn't been immune to issues, and I've actually seen a little bit of better performance from the Vantage V3 and the Suunto Race, and particularly in scenarios where I have been running near tall buildings. So there was one run where I was in kind of Germany, in Frankfurt. I was staying somewhere where I was right in the middle of the city, loads of tall buildings, perfect kind of testing scenarios for these watches. And what I found is actually that the Vantage V3 and the Suunto Race actually performed a little bit better, just in terms of looking at the GPS tracks and looking at a little bit closer in terms of how they kind of compared. And I actually saw that the Vantage V3 and the Suunto Race performed a little bit better. I've done races with the Vantage V3 and the 965 as well too, and they've generally kind of held up against each other. So for me, GPS performance has been very good. I would class the performance of all three of these watches being at that kind of top tier. I put it up with things like Apple as well too, in terms of what we got on the Apple Watch Ultra and its dual band mode as well too. I think maybe I've had a bit more better performance with the Suunto Race and the Garmin Forerunner 965, but as I said, I found with the Polar and the Suunto compared to the 965 in some scenarios, actually they perform better than the Garmin and its dual band mode.
So it comes to GPS accuracy. I've used all of these watches for a lot of running. Throughout my testing of the Suunto Race and Polar Vantage V3, I tested them against each other and I was poring over GPS tracks all the time, used them for a couple of races. I've also used all three watches at the same time a couple of times and tested them against other Garmins that I know to be accurate and things like that. And they are all really good, accurate watches in multiband mode, I'm pleased to say. Like Polar has sorted out its multiband accuracy, and Garmin and Suunto, I think, are probably the leaders in terms of accuracy with their multiband watches across the range. So over the time, my impression is, what I've noticed probably over several GPS traces and that kind of thing, is the Polar is prone to making slightly more errors in challenging conditions. It might smooth out corners a little bit more. It struggles a bit more with dead turns, or in terms of the pacing. When you look at your watch and you do a dead turn, the pacing goes a bit wild on the Polar compared to the others. Did also have one race where it went completely wrong and had a very odd route tracked for some reason compared to the Suunto, which was bang on course. So overall, I'd say that the Garmin and Suunto watches have a little edge on GPS accuracy, but it's not massive. The Polar is still a very accurate watch. for me. Heart rate accuracy has been a lot less impressive than the GPS accuracy on these watches. I'd say the worst of them is certainly the Suunto. The heart rate sensor just is almost never right on my runs. It had a couple of blinders early on, but other than that, it's been pretty much wrong throughout my testing. Actually, even sometimes is inaccurate outside of running, just when I'm at rest, which is really not a very good sign for a heart rate sensor. The Polar is probably the second worst, and the Garmin is the best of a bad bunch, I'd say. So if you are just going to have one of these watches and you're not going to connect an external sensor to track heart rate, the Forerunner 965 I think is the best, but I would connect an external heart rate sensor to any of them if I was using them and really diving into those training stats, or indeed using heart rate to guide my training sessions.
So in terms of heart rate performance, when we're talking about the optical sensors built into these watches, performance wise, in terms of running, I found the Forerunner 965 to be the most reliable and most consistent in terms of that performance. But ultimately, and we always say this, grab a chest strap. That's what I would do. That's generally what I do to get the best accuracy, because when it comes to doing things like high intensity, kind of running intervals, kind of track sessions, then all three of these watches are going to falter, and I think ultimately that's kind of what I've seen in my testing. I've had the most reliable kind of tracking on the Forerunner 965. I think I put that down to maybe the design and the watch just fitting a little bit nicer on my wrist and making sure those sensors sit most reliably and are able to deliver that data a little bit more reliably as well. I was expecting a bit more from the Polar Vantage V3 just because that's what Polar's about. They're built on heart rate, and this new kind of Elixir sensor array, which does include a kind of upgraded heart rate sensor, I just haven't seen the massive improvements for me. I've seen, there's been good runs, but there's definitely been plenty of bad runs where the average and max heart rate reading has just not quite been there against a chest strap. And then the Suunto Race, I think it just feels like the bigger watch in comparison. It doesn't seem to sit as nicely on my wrist either. And generally, I've had a, hit and miss kind of experience of Suunto's watches in general with heart rate kind of tracking. And this is definitely a version or an example where I'm not seeing a great level of data, kind of whether it's day to day, but also kind of during that kind of, running, and whether it's kind of just steady runs as well. And I think I kind of put that down to the design and maybe just being a little bit bigger and just the way it sits, I think, a little bit differently to the Vantage V3 and the 965, which I think has delivered better heart rate monitoring performance. But ultimately, from an optical, sensor point of view, I think the 965 would come out on top. I think the Vantage V3 maybe next, and then the Suunto Race. But as I said, if you're going to rely on heart rate and all the training insights that are powered by it, then I would grab an external heart rate monitor. And to be honest, on all three of these watches, I've had no issues pairing a Polar H10, a Garmin HRM Pro Plus chest strap monitor to all of these watches. It's been absolutely fine from that point of view.
Heart rate, before I say anything else about the optical sensors, if you want accurate data, get a chest strap. It's that simple. None of these optical sensors match the accuracy of a chest strap. But then if we're looking at which of the three watches in the test is most reliable, I think in my test overall it's been the Garmin. In most of my testing, the Polar V3 was on point. The Suunto had a tendency to lag, and it struggled, as most optical sensors do, with runs with big shifts in intensity. The Garmin Forerunner 965 isn't infallible, and I had the odd spike, but it seems to be more consistent. Polar came in next, really, though I don't think I'd buy any one of these over another based on the heart rate accuracy. Now, all three watches offer decent navigation skills, but I think for me the Garmin edges it here. The Forerunner 965 has a few more features around. You've got things like around me, you've got points of interest, and I think one thing is the ability to create a round trip course from the watch is dead handy. That kind of sets it apart. The Suunto's capabilities are strong too with offline maps. They've also got points of interest as well that you can navigate to, and good turn by turn. The other thing I like about the Suunto is the altitude navigation is really useful. If you're following a preloaded route with some big lumps, it will show you what's up ahead really nicely. It's good for mountain and coastal ultras. When it comes to the Polar, it lacks some of the extra tools that those two watches offer, but with route planning, I actually think Polar's tie-up with Komoot is ace. I use Komoot a lot to plan routes. I planned the whole Danube run a couple of years ago with it, and I think it's better than the Garmin and Suunto routes. I find it's a really easy tool to use. I love that you can find routes from fellow runners, so it's really handy to get a free region with the V3. That's something that appeals to me for sure.
So into mapping, and I'll start by saying that it's great to see that all three of these watches offer free offline mapping on AMOLED displays, because I think, when you have that color display here, it really does improve and elevate the experience of using and interacting with the maps. Now, in terms of that mapping experience, I'll start with the, getting the maps on the watches themselves. On the Garmin Forerunner 965, they're already preloaded. On the Polar Vantage V3, you have to download them from the Polar web app and then sync them over to the watch, which means plugging it into a computer. So not massively fun. It does take a little bit of time. And then the Suunto Race, you've got to sync it from the Suunto companion phone app, and you kind of stick it back on the charger, and then you do it over Wi-Fi. So Again, not massively straightforward, does take a while to just take a portion of a map from a region as well too. In terms of the mapping experience in general, I would say the Forerunner 965 still, for me, still, you know, it's still ahead in ways. I think it feels like there's more features behind it, there's more functionality. You know, it's not perfect, but it just feels a little bit more polished and complete. And that's understandable because this is kind of new territory for Polar and Suunto, and it's only been on the Suunto Vertical, really, in terms of that full mapping support, and now it's on the Race as well too. The Vantage V3 or the Vantage series has kind of relied on that kind of third-party support from Komoot, and now it's bringing it in and doing it natively. But some things that are kind of missing, or, you know, it's just a little bit more work to kind of get them, or get the same functionality that you're getting on the Forerunner 965. So like the turn-by-turn support, you don't have it in the native maps on the Polar Vantage V3, but you can get that turn-by-turn if you make a route in Komoot. On the Suunto Race, you have to create a route in the app and then enable turn-by-turn navigation, and then you can start using it from that sense. So there's similar functionality, but the way you get there, it's already, you know, on the Garmin it feels a little bit more set up already and letting you go out and kind of use it. And I think, as I said, there's a lot more modes behind the mapping and navigation support. I think in terms of detail of mapping, I would say the 965 is probably ahead for me, and then you've got the Suunto Race and the Polar Vantage V3.
So the maps are great on all three of these watches. The Garmin's maps are the most advanced. They are routable maps, so they know where you are on the map, which means you can create routes on the fly. It knows when you'll go wrong. It can reroute you and do stuff like that. You also get more advanced tools like Climb Pro, which I think is a brilliant addition to the watch, which looks at all the climbs and descents you have on your route and will tell you how far along each climb or descent you are and pick them out for you. So, which really helps judge effort, I found, when using the watch on really long runs. So the Suunto and the Polar, though, are fine for following routes. A couple of little quirks, like the Polar doesn't show a breadcrumb trail on the map unless you have a route set up, which I think is a bit annoying, and I hope that's something that they address with an update. Getting maps onto the watch is a fairly time-consuming process of any of them. You've got to plug the Polar in, which speeds it up, but you have to find a wire. The Suunto takes a long time to download maps over Wi-Fi. With Garmin, you have some preloaded, but if you do have to add them, you can do it via cable or wirelessly, so you have that option. And Garmin and Suunto have a good route creation option within their apps, which does help get routes onto the watch a bit more quickly. With Polar, you have to do it somewhere else, and indeed you have to use Komoot if you want to get turn-by-turn navigation, which is not ideal. In terms of the presentation of the maps, I think that it's good on all three watches, but actually on the Gorilla Glass displays, I think the maps are a bit brighter and easier to read, but with that sapphire crystal, you obviously get the extra durability, but I think it just dulls the colours a little bit, but they are still very easy to read the maps on the Suunto Race. Overall, on this one, I'd say that Garmin wins navigation of these three watches, just because of the extra tools it has there and the more advanced maps, but in terms of the practicalities of following routes on your wrist, all three of them are very, very good. So with my real-world use, with notifications coming into all of the watches, running almost every day in multi-band mode with the always-on screens enabled, the Garmin and the Suunto tended to last me about 7 days, whereas the Polar was more like 3 to 4 days. And if you look at individual activities, the Suunto Race is the one that's going to last the longest in multi-band mode, which is what I really care about. Polar has some very impressive listed stats across the range of battery life, but tends not to really live up to those stats. So that is something to be a bit wary of. I'd say overall the Vantage V3 is the worst of battery life across the board of these watches. And then the Suunto is the best, with the Garmin falling in between.
Now, if you look at the listed battery lives, they suggest that the Polar should offer the most runtime in max accuracy GPS mode, followed by the Suunto, then the Garmin. Now, in my tests, though, these watches burned at a remarkably similar rate. Polar is coming up a long way short of that claimed 61 hours. Maybe it's the settings that I've got on there. Maybe you need to lower them down to get that full out. But on the plus side, it has largely fixed its battery thirsty overnight issue. And outside of running, I get around the same drop off as those other watches now. So for a 1 hour run in max GPS modes with the always on screen settings turned off on all the watches, the Garmin burned around 3 to 4% on average, the Polar was 3% and the Suunto was 2%. Now for Ultra, all of these watches claim to have you covered for at least 24 hours on regular GPS. The Suunto and Polar offer much more in the lowest power modes, with Suunto up to 120 hours and Polar up to 140 hours. Garmin only stretches to a max of 34 hours in Ultra Track. And again, this might depend on your screen settings, among other things. But Polar and Suunto are better equipped to offer some sort of tracking for multi-day adventures. I really like the Suunto's battery burn calculator that shows you how much runtime you've got as you toggle through the different power modes. The ability to be a bit more granular in your power management GPS options on Garmin is also a win over the other watches, particularly the Polar, which doesn't let you choose the satellite settings. It just asks you how often you want the watch to pulse those satellites, so it's not as nuanced as you might be able to get on the Garmin.
Okay, so we get into battery life, which is a pretty important category here, because with all of three of these watches having an AMOLED display, as we've seen with full smartwatches that have colour displays with the same technology, and other sports watches, that does mean a bigger drop off in battery life that you are generally going to enjoy, particularly if you are tracking on a regular basis, particularly if you decide to keep the screen always on as well too, compared to transfective displays, which typically have been on these watch series before Polar, Suunto and Garmin moved to AMOLED displays. Now, in terms of my experience and how well the battery has performed, now I've used all three watches in a mix of using the raise to wake, but you're also using the screen always on. I've been using the dual band mode on all of these watches, which does drain the battery life quicker as well too, compared to regular GPS. I've had notifications running. I've had kind of general kind of heart rate monitoring as well. In terms of day-to-day performance, what I would say is I have had the best performance from the Suunto Race. And what I think I put that down to really here is that there's a little bit less going on day to day on the Suunto Race compared to the Polar Vantage V3 and the Garmin Forerunner 965. There's a little bit more on the smartwatch side going on the Forerunner 965, a bit more in terms of general monitoring as well, if you choose to kind of turn it on. And it's a similar story with the Polar Vantage V3. There's just a bit more going on in terms of day to day, and you can see that battery drop off a little bit more compared to the Suunto Race. When you get into that kind of always on mode, again, I think you get more on the Suunto Race. I think you get more on the Garmin Forerunner 965. I think you get less on the Polar Vantage V3 when you have it on in that always on display, and you're also tracking and doing all the other things that I've kind of spoken about. So from an always on point of view, I think you get a little bit more on the Suunto Race. I think the 965 probably comes in next, and it's the Polar Vantage V3. And then when you're talking about GPS performance, as I said, I've been using it in that dual band mode. I've found that on the Suunto Race, the battery drop off in the same runs, so using the same modes, has been less severe than the Forerunner 965 and the Vantage V3. So if you're looking for the best performing dual band kind of GPS performance, I would say the Suunto Race performs best. I think it's kind of neck and neck between the Vantage V3 and the 965 after that. So how good are these three watches at analysing your training? Because ultimately they're all pretty good at tracking your runs, but when it comes to giving you that additional information, which ultimately this is what you are going to be paying a little bit more money for on these watches, how useful, how well presented is that information, and ultimately is it reliable and useful to use? Now, what I'd say about these three watches is they definitely offer a comprehensive amount of kind of training modes and also training analysis. So from that point of view, now what I would say is, I think from that training analysis point of view, I think the weakest is probably the Suunto Race. And I put that down to, but there's a lot of information there that the Suunto Race provides. And ultimately, I think, whether it's on the app or whether it's on the watch, I don't think it's massively well presented on the, across the board in terms of the ecosystem. I think, the main one here is the HRV kind of recovery insight or metric, and it's something that, it's a feature we've seen on both the Polar and the Garmin's as well in different guises. But I think in terms of its usefulness and effectiveness, I just haven't found the training analysis as useful on the Suunto Race. I think there's elements there that I think are clearly good to have, but I think in terms of giving that to the user or giving it, let me see that every day and thinking, well, actually that's going to help me dictate or maybe think about what I'm going to do next, I'm not sure it's really worked that well for me. Now, the Polar Vantage V3, I think it clearly has an advantage in terms of being, for me, the best sleep tracker, and using that sleep information, that accurate sleep information, to kind of dictate the kind of recovery insights that you're getting from the Polar Vantage V3. Because if you compare the sleep tracking performance of these three watches, the Polar Vantage V3 for me is on top in terms of accuracy first and foremost, where the Garmin is, it's typically what I've seen for Garmin, where it will generally record an extra hour and it just doesn't seem as reliable with that sleep tracking. And when you're relying on sleep so heavily in terms of those that kind of analysis, I think you're getting something a little bit more reliable from the Polar Vantage V3, particularly in terms of recovery. In terms of the Garmin, I think what it gets right is the presentation of data. There's a lot of information there. What it does is, if you're struggling to kind of take it all in, it gives you that kind of snapshot in terms of the information. So if you want that and you want a little bit of guidance, then it's very easy to take that on board. Features like training readiness are just easy to kind of absorb and realize, well, actually, this is something that maybe today, based on the information that it's pulling in, that maybe I shouldn't be training today, or maybe I should look at doing a lighter session. It's not definitive guidance, but it's clearly guidance that I feel that can be useful, and it's been in line with the kind of training that I've done generally in the time I've been using it. In terms of training analysis, I would say the Garmin Forerunner 965 and the Polar Vantage V3 stand out for me. Vantage V3 because of the sleep tracking, the recovery information. Garmin Forerunner 965 because of the presentation of the data and actually the reliability of some of the things like training readiness that I think can be useful features to have in terms of kind of insights, or insights to look over kind of a training block. Whereas I think the Suunto Race has a lot of information, but I think it needs to just work and condensing it and make it a little bit more user friendly overall.
Now, training analysis, these days I tend to look much less at the vast array of training data that watches serve up, primarily because I don't really trust a lot of it. I've looked into a lot of the science behind it. Anyway, at least not beyond like a benchmarking tool. In many ways, I think we're in danger of overcomplicating things here and being overloaded with data, some of it which crosses over and doesn't correlate, and it's quite hard to know whether you're stressed or whether you're not. Anyway, here's a couple of examples of two watches worn over the same runs over the same period, and here's the training load advice that you get. And that shows you why maybe I don't trust them when I've seen these things side by side. And if you take a look at some of the Suunto coach advice that I got just yesterday, you can see if you see the problem here. But Garmin's Hill Score and Endurance Score have some appeal for benchmarking that the others don't offer. I think Polar's FuelWise feature is a handy tool for planning and tracking nutrition, mainly as a guide though, rather than something to follow as gospel. I think that kind of sets that apart for maybe if it's an ultra tool. I also like that the Polar V3 now lets you do an orthostatic test, the heart rate test, using the new ECG hardware that's built into the buttons on the watch. You no longer need to do it with a chest strap. Now, the orthostatic test is one of the best ways to measure HRV in the moment in the morning and to give you that response to training and stress. Polar's Week View, I think, is another tool that I think is better than on the other watches for showing you really quickly the balance of your overall training at a glance in a really easy way to decipher.
Training analysis, all of these watches hit the basics of training analysis well. They'll look at your training load, they'll suggest if you're overtraining, and as you do more and more with the watches, all of them will get more and more accurate on this front. I think Garmin does the best job of not only tracking a bit more and introducing some more interesting stats like Hill Score and Endurance Score, but they also present all that data better on the watch. As I say in general, I think Garmin makes better use of the AMOLED screen on the watch, just because maybe it's had it around for a bit longer, so you get a lot of nice bright colourful graphs and things like that, colour-coded things. I also do like the training readiness stat you get on Garmin. Now, obviously, this needs accurate data going into it to get an accurate data out, but if I found that if I was using a chest strap for all my training and then relying on its sleep tracking to be good enough, it's not really that accurate with Garmin sometimes, but if it's good enough, you will get a pretty meaningful training readiness stat from the watch, which distills a lot of the stuff that the watch is tracking into one easy number you can have a quick glance at. Again, this stat will get better over time as you use the watch more and more. But yeah, I do think Garmin just has the edge on training analysis in collecting and presenting a bit more data in a slightly better way, but they all do the basics of training analysis pretty well.
My verdict then, well, you've got three capable watches here with big steps forward for Polar and Suunto, who've closed the gap on Garmin in terms of that smartwatch style AMOLED display, if not the smartwatch smarts themselves, to make the most of it quite yet. I personally don't buy a watch for contactless payments or music, but if you do, the Garmin is the better choice. Now beyond that, for me, the Garmin Forerunner 965 leads the way here out of the three watches. I think the Polar comes in second, and then the Suunto, despite the considerably cheaper price tag, sort of comes in last for me. When it comes to all-round quality of design, features, accuracy, easy syncing, the interface, all of the important stuff, Garmin are still ahead of the others here, I think, in most respects. There are moments where Polar shines. I like flare touches like FuelWise and the ECG watch orthostatic test. I think Polar's design will probably suit a broader group of runners, while Suunto is a bit chunky with a certain kind of look. Polar's training platform is much better than Suunto's if you're weighing up those two, and I think Polar also offers some smarter and better presented recovery tools than you'll get on the Suunto. But if your budget allows you to consider all three, for me, I would recommend the Garmin Forerunner 965 first. If you can only stretch to Suunto's price, you're still buying a very capable tool here in the Suunto Race that will cover the basics well and a whole lot more. It is a good watch. It is a step forward for Suunto. And then the Vantage V3 probably falls between the cracks of those two. It's not the most kind of value overall, really, for what you're getting. It's also probably not the most capable. I think the Garmin gets that. So yeah, it's somewhere in the middle. If you like Polar, you're probably going to like this best. But yeah, if you're looking for capability and value, it's the Garmin and then the Suunto.
Okay, so my verdict on whether you should go for the Suunto Race, the Polar Vantage V3 or the Garmin Forerunner 965. Now, what I'll say is, I've been testing these three watches. I've gone back to using just one of these watches, and the watch that I've gone back to has been the Garmin Forerunner 965. Now, the reasons I've gone back to this and the reasons why I think this is the watch that most people should still pick, there's a few things here. First and foremost, the performance is there. You know, as I've mentioned, it hasn't been spotless and it hasn't been, you know, perfect in every scenario, but generally in terms of what I've wanted from it, in terms of tracking, in terms of the reliability of the information, the 965 has been the most consistent from that point of view. I think the other thing for me is the packaging and the software. It just feels a lot nicer to use day to day. The way the training analysis is presented as well and delivered, I think that's really important here as well too. And I think that's another reason why we look at these high-end watches and what they deliver. It's about how they're delivering them and how they are delivered in terms of presentation on and off the watch. And I think on the watch, the Garmin Forerunner 965 just gets a lot more right compared to these two watches. Now, that is not to say that the Suunto Race and the Vantage V3 are bad watches. If I had to pick one after the 965, I would probably be going for the Vantage V3. It would be the Suunto Race if that software wasn't just a little bit kind of laggy, a little bit not quite there. The Vantage V3 feels a little bit more tidy in terms of a full package, in terms of performance, in terms of what I've seen, in terms of GPS, in terms of the software, in terms of what it's been like to use day to day, in terms of the battery life performance. It's good enough for me. And I think though it's more expensive than the Suunto Race, I've just found more comfortable using it. And I have, when I've not been using the 965 and I've chosen between these two, I've opted for the Vantage V3. It's a shame because I think the Suunto Race is a fantastic watch and it's at a really good price. But I think if Suunto can address some of the software things on here, just package things up a little bit nicely compared to the Polar and the Garmin, I think offer a bit better into the presentation of training analysis as well, because the GPS performance, the battery life performance is better in general in most scenarios of these two compared to these two watches. But ultimately, for me, it's not quite there as a package. And if someone was asking me between these three watches, I would be saying the Forerunner 965. If you can't get the 965, I would be saying the Polar Vantage V3 personally, based on my experience. Suunto Race is worth looking at, but I think you've just got to be hopeful that you're not kind of hampered or have an issue with the kind of software side of things. So I think there's a lot to like about the performance, but ultimately as a package, I don't think it's as well polished as what you're getting on the Polar and the Garmin.
So my verdict is, if you're just looking for the best watch of the three, I would say it's the Garmin Forerunner 965. You just get a few extra features here that you don't get on the other watches. Things like the smart features, the better navigation tools and mapping tools, training readiness. I think it's got really good battery life. It does nearly everything the other watches do well or better. Got great GPS accuracy, passable heart rate accuracy, and I really like the design of it. So all in all, it's a fantastic watch. I say it's the best watch of the three, but the Suunto Race is the best value watch of the three because it is considerably cheaper. You get that upgrade in build quality, which will be very important for some people, and more important than things like smart features. Get really good battery life, great GPS accuracy. The user interface isn't quite as good in the Suunto Race. It's not as fun to engage with day in, day out, but on the fundamentals of sports tracking, it does everything really, really well, and it is cheaper than the other watches. Then the Polar Vantage V3 is third place for me. I think it's a great watch, but I just think when you compare it to these two watches, it comes up short on a few categories. I don't think the GPS accuracy is quite as good, although it is very good. The battery life's not quite as good, and then it still misses some of the stuff that is on the Garmin, like the music storage, the better training analysis, the better navigation tool. So yeah, for me, it'll probably come down to a choice between the Suunto Race and the Garmin Forerunner 965. Forerunner 965 is a better crossover watch in terms of the smarts it adds, the nice look, the really bright screen, and some extra tools like I've talked about. The Suunto Race is the one that offers you a bit more value, and then a bit more of an adventure-ready watch with that sapphire crystal display, the very long single-activity battery life, that kind of thing. So those are the two watches I'd be picking between if I was looking at these three. Alrighty, that is our comparison of these three very impressive AMOLED watches. Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you're looking to buy any of these, or if you have any questions about them, please do like and subscribe, ring the little bell, and we will see you next time on the Run Testers.